Welcome, everyone. Greetings, and a very warm welcome to all of you who are joining online and in person. It's a very special pre-book launch event for Dr. Peyvand Firouzeh. We will hand it over very shortly to our colleague, Dr. Mushiri. But let me say, on behalf of the Institute of Iranian Studies, I would like, at the very outset, we introduce our distinguished guest, to express our collective gratitude to Canada's Indigenous people, and acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it has been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and most recently, the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, this meeting place continues to be the home of many Indigenous people across Turtle Island. And we are grateful to have the opportunity to live, to teach, and learn on their ancestral homeland. I will very soon hand it over to my colleague, Dr. Mushiri. But again, on behalf of the Institute of Iranian Studies, a very warm welcome to you all, and we're very excited about this event. And thank you to Dr. Hakali for hosting, and Dr. Firouzeh for joining us. Dr. Mushiri?
Thank you. It's my pleasure to welcome you. Dr. Firouzeh is lecturer in Islamic Art History at the University of Sydney and an Australian Research Council DECRA fellow. She's a trained architect and art historian specializing in medieval and early modern art and architecture from the Islamic world. Research interest in art of Sufism, the interaction of image, space, and text, Indian ocean studies, and the mobility of artistic and intellectual networks within and beyond the Persianate world. A forthcoming monograph, which will be the subject of the talk today, called Intimacies of Global Sufism, which will be published by Indiana University Press in 2025, addresses the relationship between mysticism, materiality, and mobility, focusing on a series of upcoming understudied sacred sites in Iran and India. The book uses the concept of intimacy to redraw the boundaries between small devotional spaces and monumental structures, as well as between local and global histories of faith and art making. Dr. Firouzeh's research has been supported by grants from Australian Research Council, Getty Research Institute, American Council of Learned Societies, the Max Planck Society, the Bodleian Library at University of Oxford, the Willison Foundation Trust, the British Institute of Persian Studies, and the Iran Society, among others. Dr. Firouzeh, welcome to Toronto and welcome to our institute.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome. I also want to extend my thanks to Dr. Tabakoli for inviting me to give this talk, and to Dr. Hashmi for organizing everything around this talk. I'm really honored to be here to do this pre-launch book talk, which is really the first of the book talks that I'm doing on this book. So I'm really excited to be among this group of esteemed colleagues and audience online. So thank you so much for joining. So what I'm going to do today is I'll start with an overview of the book, methodological framework of the book, and then I'll look at a couple of case studies in more detail, including the room that you see an image of on the screen right now. Just make sure. Okay, great. Outside the city of Vidar in Karnataka, India, which was once the capital of the Bahmanid Sultanate, an intensely painted royal tomb completed in the 1430s inscribes the poetry of the Iranian Sufi Shah Mir-Djalali in monumental calligraphy. Around the same time, A response to this invocation is materialized in mosaic tile work across the ocean in the small town of Mohan in Iran, on the portal of Shah Nematullah's home tomb, blessing the Indian king Ahmad Shah Bahmani as the Sufi's long-distance disciple. The epigraphical dialogue between the two buildings mimics a conversation between a Sufi and a disciple, a conversation that, in the case of Shah Nematullah and Ahmad Shah Bahmani, never took place outside the realm of written correspondence or dreams and visions. Disappeared. Great. Thank you so much. I hope you didn't miss too much of it online. Okay, so the materiality and effective appeal of the two inscriptions connected them beyond the realm of text. Inscriptions were part of extensive epigraphic programs of funerary structures that were initially constructed as single dome chambers and expanded considerably over time into a royal necropolis in the case of Omidyar, that you see on the top right, and a multi-layered shrine complex in the case of Mohan, that you see on the top left. Both inscriptions were written in the Thulus calligraphic script in Persian, in white against a blue background, painted on plaster in the tomb in Omidyar, and executed in polychrome tiles in Mohan. Both also hold a proportionally dominant position in relation to the inscription panels surrounding them. They're legible to readers and shape the experience of pilgrimage to the two sites by foregrounding trans-regional connections across the ocean. Great. The two buildings in Omidyar and Mohan were part of a network of shrines and related funerary structures associated with Shah Nematullah Wali and his followers that emerged starting from the 15th century across southern Iran and the central south region of India, known as the Deccan, mobilized by the sea routes and monsoon winds that facilitated connectivity between the southern parts of Iran and ports of western India. These sacred spaces were a meeting point of our itinerant Sufis, local and peripatetic artists, merchants, courtiers, and kings. Their collaborations and competitions developed the shrines into rich palimpsests of artistic innovation, devotion, and transoceanic dialogue. Encompassing monumental shrine complexes, small retreat rooms, devotional wall paintings, manuscripts, and ritual carpets, these artifacts demand to be examined as part of a transregionally connected story. The visual conversations between these objects and spaces did not merely reflect the inherent mobilities of Islamic, Persianate, and Indian Ocean walls, but they also actively forged a physical and sensorial mode of connection between sacred landscapes that were increasingly felt to be, as one contemporary letter described, united by the sea in between. Such dialogues invite us to consider the power of devotional art and visual culture to redefine the trans-regional, global, and the early modern beyond the scope of European voyages of exploration. What did it mean for Sufis and artists to construct shrines that engaged local audiences, invoked distant places, and simultaneously appealed to trans-regional pilgrims and merchants? How did they navigate tensions between placemaking and spirituality vis-a-vis their expanding trans-regional network? These questions, which point to the perennial problems of art history's approach to Sufi material culture, lie at the heart of this book. As I've discussed in the book, one problem is that despite the inherent mobility of Sufi networks and their recognition as a global phenomenon by historians, Sufism's potential for global art histories has not been adequately explored, even as questions of global connectivity have become central, if contentious, themes in the field of art history. Another problem is that despite visual and textual evidence, Sufi artists and Sufi patrons have been assigned a peripheral place in China studies and global art histories. The unifying aim of Intimacies of Global Sufism is to make sense of these two seemingly contradictory sides of Sufi material culture, its tendency towards asceticism and its investment in monuments of trans-regional expansion. The Ne'matullahi shrines offer an ideal case for addressing the problem of Sufi material culture that I just outlined. Shah Ne'matullah himself was an avid traveler whose journeys took him from Cairo and Mecca to Samarkand and Herat, as well as areas around Kerman and Yazd, travels that were undertaken for pilgrimage in search of well-known teachers to disseminate his own teachings, and at times at the request of ruling authorities, as was common among Sufis. Shah Ne'matullah was not a renunciatory Sufi. The Ne'matullahi doctrine was shaped around the principle of khalwat dar anjaman, or solitude within society, which encouraged integration into the society while practicing Sufism. The Ne'matullahi's interpretation of such principles, which led to their intermingling with powerful political and social factions of the society, combined with their remarkable transregional mobility, has resulted in an abundance of material traces across the regions concerned in this book. Shah Ne'matullah's descendants and followers continued this practice of constant mobility. I'm not sure how much you can see, and expanded it in scale. Absolutely, yes. So Shah Ne'matullah's descendants and followers continued this practice of constant mobility and expanded it in scale. Organized as a network of sedentary and mobile Sufi communities, they flourished in several parts of what is today Iran and Uzbekistan from the late 14th century, spreading into Deccan India from the first half of the 15th century. After the disintegration of the Bahmanis and the return of some members of the family to Iran during the Safavid period, another wave of transregional movement took a number of family members to the Mughal courts in Lahore and Delhi, and subsequently, alongside Mughal campaigns in the 17th century, to the south, to the Deccan once again. In the book, I focused on some of the major shrines of the Ne'matullahis. The partially extant Shah Wali Khanaqah, or Sufi Lodge, in the small southern Iranian town of Taft, the shrine of Shah Ne'matullah Wali in Mahan in central Iran, the funerary complex of the Sufi son in the city of Bidar in Deccan, India, and the neighboring tomb of Shah Ne'matullah's disciple, the Bahmani king Ahmad Shah I. I studied these sites alongside a number of projects patronized by the Sufi family outside their shrine networks in cities like Yazd and Delhi. Despite the somewhat canonical status of these surviving monuments in Persian and South Asian art history, the sites and the objects that they contained have only been discussed in survey books and single articles, and some have never been published before. While the religious history of the Ne'matullahi network has been the subject of a number of studies, no art historical monograph has ever been dedicated to their sacred spaces, and nor have their sites in Iran and India ever been studied together from a transregional perspective. The thread that runs through the architectural projects and objects considered in this book is the push and pull effect between the global and the intimate in the title of the book. I use the term global in this book not in a geographically exhaustive sense, an interpretation that arguably would always be riddled by blind spots. Rather, I use it as a provocation to build on the work of scholars who carve out a space for transregional art histories that take place outside of a Eurocentric or Euro-proximate framework. I'm also more interested in how the global and the intimate balance each other out. Intimacy resists the grand view from above that the global framework gravitates towards. On the other hand, defined against the intimate and effective, the global becomes more a matter of a scale rather than a strict geographical notion. I also argue that the global is a matter of perception and self-presentation, whether in poetic metaphors or explicit engagements with transregional politics. The Ne'matullahis described and presented themselves as socio-political actors on an expansive scale that to them encompassed the whole world. I use the concept of intimacy in a variety of ways in the book to navigate between the micro and macro, the proximate and the distant, the devotional and the political. In this talk, I'm going to focus on one of the ways that I've used the notion of intimacy in the book, that is, its role in rethinking the significance of the small places and their multisensorial inner workings for writing global histories of art. Delving into the small space also foregrounds the agency of Sufis in shaping their material environments. So let me give you a few examples from the shrine of Shah Ne'matullah Wali in Mahan. And before I do that, I will offer a quick overview of the shrine and its development over the centuries. Hagiographic narratives indicate that the site of the shrine at Mahan was a garden with a humble khanaqah during the life of Shah Ne'matullah. The oldest part of the shrine complex at Mahan is the sepulchre of Shah Ne'matullah Wali, which is marked here in orange, both in the plan and in the elevation, which was constructed over his grave after his death in 1431 and lies near the center of the east-west axis of the expanded complex. This is the dome chamber whose inscribed canal I've showed you earlier. Over a period of more than 500 years, the mausoleum has expanded into what is today one of the largest shrines in Iran, exceeded only by the shrine of Imam Reza in Mashhad and that of Masum in Qom. The gradual enlargement of the Mahan shrine followed a strong axial layout, with 4 courtyards aligning along the east-west axis, oriented roughly towards Mecca. The original 15th century funerary dome chamber remained unaltered until the late 16th century, when the complex was expanded westward by the addition of a vaulted hall known as the Darul Hufaz, or the Quran recitation hall. This expansion, which is marked in yellow in the plans, most likely coincided with the courtyard beside it, which is known as the Old Courtyard, or Sahn al-Kohan, or the Shah Abbasi Courtyard, after the Safavid monarch, with whose reign the patronage of the courtyard and the recitation hall is associated. Eastward and westward expansions continued in the 19th and 20th centuries, and these are marked in green and clear on the fan. Here I'm showing you a few of the 19th century and 20th century expansions. To tease out the intimacy of these spaces, I pay special attention to intensely refurbished corners of the shrine complex and ritual objects such as carpets, all of which serve as sites of devotional, multisensorial, and intimate engagement for Sufi bodies. Take, for instance, the portal in the shrine at Mahan, marking the threshold of the sacred mausoleum of Shah Mir-Djalali. The portal is a stand time and again by patrons and ruling authorities who left their marks on the outer skin of the mausoleum. This was the outer skin of the mausoleum before the expansion of the complex. So we have the Bahmanis of the Deccan, the Aqoyunlu Turkmen rulers, and governor of central Iran acting under the Safavid ruler Shah Abbas. In contrast to these markers of authority on the outer layers of the shrines, I show how in their innermost parts, inscriptions regarding relations of kinship and familial genealogies were prioritized over those dedicated to the patrons. This carefully crafted program of epigraphy was used to create a measured sense of distance between Sufis and their patrons. The Sufis never shared an inscribed surface with ruling patrons in the most intimate parts of their sacred spaces, an absence that becomes all the more conspicuous because of its consistency across the broader trans-regional network of Ni'matullahi shrines. Two examples in particular epitomize the role of inscribing in creating a sense of belonging for the Sufi family and their disciples. The first is a group of carpet fragments, and the second is a retreat room. So the first example I'm showing you is this group of canonical but little studied carpets currently kept in the National Museum of Bosnia and Herzegovina in Sarajevo that were commissioned in the 17th century for the interior of the mausoleum of Shah Ni'matullah in the shrine at Mahan. I consider the design, epigraphy, and a spatial arrangement of the fragments to explore how the carpets served as extensions of both the architecture and the body of the pilgrim. Importantly, the carpets are inscribed with commissioned and personalized verses of poetry that, through both subtle metaphors and unambiguous references, comment on the very space that they were made for and record the Ni'matullahi descendant who patronized the carpets among inscribed genealogical lines of important members of the family in the 17th century. So the words that I have in red in the Persian inscriptions are names of the members of the family that are inscribed on the carpet. Despite the clarity of the self-referential poems that place the patronage of the carpets within the Ni'matullahi family, they have continuously been misrepresented as a Safavid royal patronage by Shah Abbas II. In the book, I use methods of digital humanities to reconstruct the intimate space of the mausoleum in relation to these carpets. Since the carpets were removed from the shrine in the 19th century, these 3D reconstructions, two examples of which, so the two above are the reconstructions, two examples of which you see on this slide, shed light on the intimate relationship between the space and its textiles, between architecture and ritual, and also the close ties between the family and the building. And these inscriptions on the carpets also kind of mirror what the inscriptions on the walls of the mausoleum are doing in terms of their self-referentiality to the members of the family. The digital, in this sense, seeks to simulate a spatial and corporeal experience of the sacred space. I argue that the lack of acknowledgement for the Ni'matullahi family's patronage of the carpets reveals two interrelated sets of biases in art historical discourse. First is the over-reliance on royal attributions in the study of high-quality textiles and carpets. The consensus has been that intricacy, precision, and good draftsmanship points to court patronage. Second, this tendency towards assuming royal patronage is also symptomatic of the broader marginalization of the Sufis' role in the active creation of art and material culture, depriving them of agency in the making of their own spaces, an agency that they repeatedly insist upon in the carpet's epigraphy themselves. Especially in the late 16th and 17th centuries, the surfaces of the shrine at Mahan increasingly came to showcase local artists, disciples of the order, and members of the family as makers of devotional objects and spaces. We see this, for instance, in the recitation hall, where signatures of a craftsman appear in a series of small roundels carrying the title Ni'mat-Allahi, that you see detail up on the right, distinguished in amber from the rest of the signature formula, to declare and add weight to the artist's membership in the confessional network of Ni'mat-Allahi Sufis. This is one other example of the same thing. Similar conjunctions of displaying artistic and Sufi affiliation can be seen in a small retreat room in the shrine at Mahan, which features the work of another disciple artist, where art making converged with rituals of meditation. Similar strategies of incorporating familial genealogies into epigraphic programs, like the one that we saw in the Mahan carpet fragments, can also be witnessed in this retreat room. And we're going to spend the rest of our time today in this small room. To give you a sense of the scale and location of this room in relation to other elements of the shrine at Mahan, let me show you the plan. So the room is located across the hall from the mausoleum. So if this is the mausoleum of Shah Ni'matullah, this is the room we're talking about. So it's this tiny blue square. My aim is to offer an understanding of the room as the devotional and artistic project of a disciple, one that engages the body of the viewer in order to activate a bodily representation of the Sufi master Shah Ni'matullah Wali. The room is known as the Chella-Khane or Khalbat-Khane or place of retreat, and is one of a series of cells within the Safavid hall. So you see the entrance of the room right here, and it's a series of the rooms. So if this is the Dar al-Hufaz and this is the courtyard, these are the doors to the other rooms that are like our Chella-Khane, but none of them actually have the decorations that I'm going to show you, and none of them are also accessible through the Dar al-Hufaz itself. So they can just be entered from the courtyard. Khaldat and a number of related terms such as riyazat, uzlat, and chelde, which literally means 40 days, generally refer to periods of self-isolation dedicated to medication as well as other rituals meant to purify the soul and connect with the divine. The historical practice of khalbat is in large part shrouded in mystery, especially to those outside the circles of discipleship, and only becomes partially accessible through sporadic textual and visual sources that describe it or offer guidelines. Questions of materiality, bodily configurations, and sensory stimuli, which play a crucial role in the process of khalbat, have rarely been studied from an art historical perspective, although they have been a subject of investigation in adjacent fields. In this regard, the Chella-Khane opens up an opportunity to explore what physical places can tell us about the intimate and internal process of retreat. The Chella-Khane in Mahan is fully painted and inscribed using poetry written by a disciple of the Sufi order, perhaps the same one responsible for painting the room. This seems to have been a personal devotional project, as indicated by the content of the verses, which, among other things, engage with the disciples' expression of devotion to the Sufi master Shah Ni'matullah, to the Prophet Muhammad, and Imam Ali. We see the otherwise unknown disciples' signatures, both outside the entrance and several times within the poetry inscribed on the walls inside the room. So here we have the signature of Abdul Wafai Talibi Ni'matullahi. So again, we have the affiliation expressed in the signature, one of the students of Hazrat Shah Ali. In popular belief, the room located in the corner of the 16th century hall is considered the oldest part of the shrine complex, one that was used for retreat by Shah Ni'matullah himself during his lifetime, about 2 centuries before the construction of this hall where the room is located. It is likely that a now lost structure of the spot was used by the Sufi for retreat, but we don't have any information to prove or disprove that. And I'm not really concerned with the questions of the authenticity of this popular belief. The room is not dated, but there are references in the poetry inscribed on the walls to influential figures of the Ni'matullahi family who were active at the end of the 16th and early 17th century. Both the names of these Ni'matullahi figures and some of the design features of the room connected to the Mohan carpet fragments, which I briefly discussed before, and which are dated to 1656 and 1657 in their inscriptions. So it is safe to place the room's interior program in the 17th century, probably in the second half of the 17th century. The adjacent recitation hall, the late 16th century edition, is a space of grandness and openness, emphasized by the natural light coming in through the ceiling. The small painted room, having no windows and measuring about 2 by 4 meters, with a height of about 5 meters at its highest point, stands in sharp contrast to the qualities of the hall. The room is a place of pause, of intense bodily engagements. One has to adjust their body to pass its threshold. In this sense, it is a reminder of the actual caves or cave-like spaces, which we know through textual and visual traditions as important places of retreat, meditation, and revelation for mystics and prophets alike. The bodily engagements with the small space of the room were further intensified by the fact that during periods of retreat, which would span from hours to 40 and 120 days of seclusion, meditation, fasting, and praying, the words and images on the walls were the main physical sources of visual interaction for those inside the room. This intensive encounter with images and words were sharpened by other sensory inputs: the limited amount of light and the smell of oil lamps and likely incense burners, and the sound of chanting or dhikr, which was an indispensable part of the order's rituals. Fasting and sleep deprivation may have heightened the senses. And it is also possible that the ingestion of psychedelics and intoxicants have accompanied and impacted viewers' use of the space. The Ni'matullahi ritual of Sama, or musical session, as reported by a 15th century hagiographer, did not consist of dancing, whirling, running, or moving. Rather, Shah Ni'matullah would simply sit still and move his head from one side to another. Singing and chanting and musical instruments such as the pipe and daf were allowed. Given these guidelines, the room must often have been experienced while seated on the floor, and give you a view kind of like this. Despite this relatively static position compared to a dance-based sama, the viewer's gaze would have been kept in motion, not only by the swift movements of the head, but by the alteration of colors in consecutive bands of inscription and the change in the direction of writing, especially in elements like the roundels, and abstract flowers covering the walls. Even when the viewer was not reading the inscriptions, such varied components could lead the eye to wander over the surfaces of the room. The sense of constant motion generated by the twisting, inscribed segments of the dome would have intensified the dizzying, ecstasy-inducing effect of the ritual movement of devotees' heads. There seems to be a relationship between Sufi recitation rituals and inscriptions within the rings. Depending on their location and lighting, it is possible that some of the inscriptions were recited out loud as part of a dhikr or sama ritual by individuals, or that the nature of these recitations performed during the rituals informed the composition of the room's poetry by the disciple artist. Some of the inscriptions contain verses that build upon popular invocations of Imam Ali and his fabled sword Zulfiqar. When read out loud, some of these verses include sounds that resemble the short and commonly repetitive invocations used for dhikr, which were mostly recited by heart. I will give you an example, but I'm not going to read the English translation and just the Persian so that you can listen to the repetitive sounds that these lines are creating. Zulfiqar Ali's Tir Shah Bala, Tir Shah Bala, Zulfiqar Ali's. Zulfiqar Ali's Saftaran dar Ghaza, Saftaran dar Ghaza, Zulfiqar Ali's. Every second hemistich in these verses repeats the previous one in a chiasmic A-B-B-A format. These repetitions both simplify the message and lend it a strong emphasis and rhythm. Another common trope in the formulaic phrases written or used for dhikr was to play with words derived from a given Arabic root. This trait is seen in some of the verses inscribed on the north wall of the room. Elahé ya Elahé ya Elahé, Karima ya Rahima ya Elahé, Karimi ya Karam dari Karam kon, Rahima ya Karima ya Elahé, To bakhshayande bakhsha be bande, To'i bakhshande bakhsha ya Elahé. Apart from the repeated words and those sharing the same roots, the fast rhythm of these verses mirrors the bodily movements and breathing pattern dictated by dhikr, deployed during the rituals in pursuit of ecstatic experience. Breath control was an integral part of dhikr, whether through intentional breathing patterns or the forceful enunciation of words and syllables in verse. Examples of this general kind are abundant in the room and demonstrate the oral potential of this space. It's important to remember that none of the inscriptions in the room are Quranic, nor there seems to be a single case of borrowing from pre-existing poetry, not even the poetry of Shah Ni'matullah, as was so common in Ni'matullahi architectural inscriptions in Iran and India. Rather, all of the verses inscribed in the Chelakhanas seem to have been written specifically for this space, for different parts and corners of the architecture, and in dialogue with the imagery adorning it, a phenomenon that I refer to as a spatial poetry. Verses written or adapted for a specific space, inscribed on its surfaces, and understood in terms of the viewer's presence and movement within it. This kind of a spatial poetry is not necessarily understood in a linear way as it would be read on paper, but rather by inhabiting this space. The labor-intensive process of composing the poetry and inscribing and painting this room could be understood as a meditative practice in itself, elevating the artist to a higher status in his path of discipleship. Through their orality, the poems discussed here become active participants in the performance of the ritual itself. Even if these verses were not used in the rituals, their compatibility with those commonly used in dhikr and the rhythmic nature, which is amplified by the repetition of the visual elements on the walls, instates a sense of companionship between the architecture and its users, as if the walls of the Chellakhane echoed the ecstatic chanting of the disciples. Given the degree of concentration and contemplation demanded from users of the room during a retreat, the possibility of a direct, deep engagement with the poetry cannot be discounted. Nevertheless, there is a tension between orality and legibility in the room. In a space where little bodily movement was likely to take place, with limited light and some distance between the eye and certain inscriptions, such as those under the dome, the question of legibility cannot be ignored. Any of these inscriptions might have been recognized without needing to be read for those who knew them, akin to mnemonic aids. At the same time, like other heavily inscribed spaces, the meaning of these words was not limited to the reading experience alone. Different levels of effective response could be activated by reading or not reading the inscriptions. Among the recurrent images in the Chellakhane are the four bifurcated swords, depicted on panels that rise from the dado of each wall to a height above the entrance door. These represent the fabled sword of Ali, known as Zulfaqar, as I mentioned earlier. The medallions, cartouches, and diagonal bands of inscriptions located within and around the sword imagery speak to its materiality and symbolic meanings, as well as themes of sacrifice, jihad, and messages of protection, suggesting that there may have been a talismanic aspect to the room. However, the text and imagery covering the walls believed to wield protective powers, and how were these powers activated? In configurations that are loosely comparable to early modern inscribed swords, the inscriptions on and around the painted swords in the room contain messages of encouragement, reassurance, and protection for both the viewer and maker, indeed for whoever grasps onto the sword and takes part in war for the faith. In conjunction with this type of somatic engagement, the inscriptions also conflate the Zulfaqar with the sword of Shah Ni'matullah. The verses inscribed around the hilt of the sword on the north wall are one example. Darim be dast qabze Shah, in qabze be kaf negah darim. We hold the sword or qabza of the Shah in our hand. We will hold this hilt or qabza in the palm of our hand. By connecting parts of the sword with parts of the body, not only the viewer's body, but also that of Shah Ni'matullah, and in other cases Imam Ali, the poetry in the room instills an embodied experience of viewing, reading, and holding the sword that merges the ordinary bodies of the viewers with these sacred bodies. As in the case of talismanic garments and arms, the protective messages in the room could have extended to battles on the path of discipleship against day-to-day sources of anxiety, such as illness, hardship, or even concerns for protection during rituals and ceremonies. However, alongside the general protective effects of the room's interior program, the maker of the room could have been responding to a context specific to the history of Sufi militancy, a common phenomenon in the early modern Islamic world and within the Ni'matullahi community. Throughout the history of the Ni'matullahi Sufis in Iran, its members had their closest ties with courtly circles in the Safavid period. They repeatedly intermarried into the Safavid family, as indicated by the color orange on the family chart here, and held high official positions of viziers and governors. Many of the names in orange are actually Safavid women, princesses. Followers of the order had taken up the role of warrior Sufis and engaged in several Safavid military campaigns. One example was Amir Nizamuddin Abd al-Baqi here, one of the Ne'matullahi descendants, whose names is also inscribed in the room, who held the position of Sad at the Safavid court and was killed, was married to a Safavid princess and was killed while leading a faction of the Safavid army in the famous Battle of Chaldiran between the Safavid ruler Shah Ismail and the Ottomans in 1514. In addition to that, in the late 16th century, and right around the time of the completion of the recitation hall that was added to the shrine, the Ne'matullahi family, in collaboration with local governors, got involved in kind of a civil war against the Safavid court. It seems that in a failed attempt, they tried to install one of the descendants of the Sufi saint, the son that was born as a result of an intermarriage between the Sufi order and the Safavid court, as an independent ruler in the region. Some of the imagery and writings on the walls, especially around the swords, could be interpreted as devices for commemorating this chapter of the order's history, which happened about 50 years prior. By encouraging engagement with the image of the swords, the inscriptions also recall illustrations of the seal of prophecy and sandals of the prophet in devotional manuscripts or hilyas and related text image devices whose protective and ambulative qualities were activated by the reader's touch. Visually, too, the walls of the Chellekhane resonate with contemporary talismanic textiles, shirts, and manuscripts in their talismanic textiles, talismanic shirts, and manuscripts in their arrangement of swords and medallions, their density of inscriptions, and the intensity of their color palette. As in the case of amulets and talismans, the repetition and symmetry of verbal and visual resources in the room was likely aimed to increase their devotional and protective efficacy. The sword's repetition on the four walls of the room, albeit with different details and inscriptions, reinforces its potential to assume a seal-like status. So you see four of these swords here. You see the forget the sword here, here. So just like that was the beginning. The efficacy of the broader visual program of the room lies in how it weaves the protective effect of word and image together with devotional practices and embodied spatial experience. The arresting quality of this interior must be understood in terms of its small size. The proximity of the viewer's body to the words and images on the walls interacts with the height of the ceiling to create a sense of upward extension, opening into the vertical orientation in the room. As the gaze moves upwards, it gravitates toward the large, segmented, twisting motif under the apex of the dome. This 12-bore swirling motif, big motif I'm talking about, is another textile-related element in the room that likely represents the Sufi hat of the order, the Taj or crown of Shah Ne'matullah, which was placed on the head of disciples in Sufi initiation ceremonies. The swirling segments of this motif join in the center, morphing into a smaller 12-bore hat in relief. The poetic inscriptions within each of the 12 bores are dedicated to praise for one of the 12 Shia imams, with subtle wordplays on their names. These inscriptions do not engage in the kind of self-referential wordplays discussed in the case of the swords, and refrain from placing the name of Shah Ne'matullah in the line of succession. Rather, such tasks are reserved for the 12-lobed abstract flowers on the walls of the room that you see here, center. Connected in both shape and arrangement to the swirling motif under the cupola, the flower motif could be interpreted as a two-dimensional representation of a segmented hat. The inscriptions in each lobe, too, cast these flower-like elements as the Ne'matullahi crown, while further inscriptions indicate that they have been passed down from Imam Ali through his descendants one by one to Abul Wafa, the disciple artist who's the maker of the room, who thus promotes himself as the culminating figure in the chain of initiation. As such, both this spatial and epigraphic arrangement imply that the main Taj or crown under the dome passed down through the walls as initiation hats for the disciples. No visual evidence survives from Shah Nematullah's lifetime for the appearance of this Taj or his initiation hat. Prior to these spatial representations of the Nematullahi crown in the Chellekhane, there were only textual descriptions of the hat in real or imagined accounts of Sufi initiation ceremonies. The earliest mention of the Nematullahi headdress appears in a 15th century biography of Shah Nematullah in context of a dream of the Bahmani ruler Ahmad Shah I. In the dream, Shah Nematullah places the hat, described as Taj-e-Shahi or crown of kingship, on Ahmad Shah's head with his own hands. While the hagiographic account does not offer any details on the shape of the Taj, a retrospective version of the same account from the early 17th century chronicle of the Deccan Sultanates by Firouzeh specifies that the initiation hat, whose bestowal in Ahmad Shah's dream marked his successful accession to the throne in the Deccan, was green and comprised of 12 segments. Another hagiography of Shah Nematullah, completed in the first years of the 16th century, notes that early on, the initiation hat of the order had 5 segments until a disciple made a 12-part felt hat and presented it to Shah Nematullah, who approved its production for all of his followers. The use of 12-segmented Taj continued among the disciples of the order, as 19th century paintings of the Nematullahi had on a variety of media attest. So this could be one such example, and you can see the lines on the segments. In several of the verses inscribed in the Chellekhane, the sword or flower is both an attribute of the Sufi and a surrogate for Shah Nematullah himself. Taking a step back and reconsidering the different elements of the Chellekhane together, the corporeal representation of the Sufi body amounts to more than a mere array of attributes scattered around the room. Surveying the most prominent visual and verbal elements of the room from bottom to top, we first encounter the swords depicted just above the dados. The fabled sword of Ali, reminiscent of actual bifurcated swords that were made in the early modern period and would have been worn around one's belt. Above these are extensive architectural surfaces painted in a manner similar to talismanic textiles, costumes worn on the torso of warriors and those in need of protection. Moving up at the apex of the room is the initiation hat of the Sufi. Each of these elements, the swords, the textile-like surfaces, and the hat, are arranged to strike a correspondence between the architecture and the human body, as if to project each part of the Sufi's body into space, from waist to hand, torso, and head. In this way, the architecture presents itself as analogous to the body of the beloved. Activated by self-referential poetry, which in turn resonates with ritual chants, the representation of the Sufi master takes on a complex corporeal dimension whose ultimate goal is not a mimetic imitation of the blessed body, so much as the merging of the sacred with the viewer's own body. As we take up the sword, we touch what the sacred figure has touched. At the same time, by filling the space that embodies him, we take his place. This interplay of text, image, and space creates a material interpretation of the moral qualities of Shah Nematullah, painstakingly recounted in the epigraphic program of the room. In this respect, the room could also be read as a spatial adaptation of the hilyas of the Prophet Muhammad. Typically laid out two-dimensionally on paper, the hilya is a genre of devotional art, also doffed as a verbal portrait that represents the physical and moral qualities of the Prophet through verbal, non-figural images and allegories. A parallel to this understanding of the Chellehane as a three-dimensional hilya, as a three-dimensional hilya-like space, can be found in 18th century Ottoman hilyas of the Prophet, in which discrete sections of the hilya are described metaphorically as body parts. Keeping the image of the Sufi master before one's eyes during retreat and rituals of dhikr was a strategy promoted by some Sufi orders for spiritual guidance. In the Chellehane, by extension, the disciples would have also been enveloped by his spatial representation, his initiation hat suspended over their heads, swords passed down to a level within the reach of their hands, and protected verses inscribed on all sides in a manner reminiscent of textiles turned inside out on themselves, as if to evoke an intimate embrace, establishing a deep sense of interiority in the space. Disciples would have entered the room believing or hoping that the power of this coalescence of word, image, and space would protect them on the battlefield and in their everyday life along their path of discipleship. Thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Excellent. Thought-provoking. I didn't have the chance to be to that, but but now you show us beautiful things and the meetings. So floor is open for questions both online and in person. Please raise your virtual hands or your picture.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for this brilliant presentation. Really enjoyed it. And putting the facade and the building in a larger historical context, with the names that you identified and what was in Chellehane and other sites, proper names, it seems like the work was not done at once, but it was done during a long duration. So in a sense, what we see is not a product of, let's say, 1820s or 1650s, but a work in progress that emerges, and the names are of various generations rather than a single generation of materiality. Can you explain the implication of that the building that we see as a work in progress rather than something that was designed in advance, all the inscriptions were done, and many of the spaces must have been sort of open for new names and new forms, attributes to be added. How does the building work in that case?
Yeah.
It's like a painting.
Yeah, it was always treated like a canvas that would be altered. And that's also why at some point I used the term palimpsest, which is a concept that I worked with in the book. And you see that in almost all of the shrine complexes in Iran and the Deccan that I worked with. The kind of patterns of movements that I showed in the maps, they also kind of correspond with how these buildings really expanded over time. So this is why they're very layered. And you can see these layers sometimes covering each other, sometimes covering earlier layers, names, markers of patronage. Sometimes you get a glimpse of them, but not everything. But as a result of that, I think many of these spaces that I'm working with are almost like that family tree. It's like they're coming back and adding those names and markers to kind of commemorate how the Sufi order was expanding, surviving, what kind of financial means they had in each period of time to do what kind of projects. And what's also really interesting is that one thing that I really wanted to emphasize in the book is that at times, these kind of patterns of additions and expansion correspond with the kind of court patronage that they received and the relationships with the court, but not always. There are periods, historical periods, that are kind of considered to be downtimes because there are conflicts going on with the Safavids, with Qajars. But you see pushbacks, or you see kind of a smaller, but these kind of intimate projects. The carpets that I showed you happened in a period of time that is considered to be a really difficult time for the members of the order. That's when the kind of, if we can call it, the second wave of migrations to India happened, to the Mughal court. But you see that the material evidence doesn't necessarily line up with the historical evidence. And I think that's also really important to keep in mind, that, why it's important to not just look at these materials through the lens of court patronage, but also what was coming from outside of the family and the network. But I really like your point about, how his names are kind of being added. There isn't one period of time that you can say the building is finished. They are never finished, maybe not even now. And I also wanted to kind of replicate that, because I think they're going back to the buildings, adding things, adding new layers. And that's also something that I've tried to replicate in the book. I don't have, none of my chapters are just on one building from the beginning to the end, but I kind of try to revisit each side, replicating those kind of patterns of migration and inhabiting the building, and then probably spending more time in the back and then coming back again under the Safavids and so on and so forth.
And just to follow up, I'm wondering whether it has any kind of graffiti kind of quality, in a sense that with the change of regimes, the change of generations, someone comes and, as you noted it, that paints over or writes over the earlier generation, or if the king or the sultan was their patron, cover it up and someone else's name comes like that. And if that's the case, whether there are traces of this covering up.
That's a really good question. I don't know of necessarily names that have been covered. If there are such examples, we don't know of them, but there are in when I mentioned that the mausoleum of Shah Nematullah was a single building, and when it expanded, a lot of things had to change. So the outer layer of the building were completely changed. The second walls were added in front of the facades, and through restoration campaigns, in some parts, the Cultural Heritage Foundation has kind of opened a couple of holes so that you can actually see the older layers, and they actually include exquisite tile work from 15th century, for instance. We can't see everything, obviously, because it's really an underlayer. But I think they move things around, but they're still keeping the names of earlier patrons and rulers who supported the buildings. At least that's what we can see and know.
We have an online question. Go back and forth from online. Sure. Anita, please unmute yourself and ask the question.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Many thanks for this really informative presentation. That was truly almost an hour of a lot of things that could deal with the architecture and the wall scripts and many aspects of the Sufi order of the Ni'matullahs and so on. And that was I expressed my word of thanks and gratitude to the speaker. So my question shortly: most of the tombs and architectural complex related to the Sufi Brotherhood or Sufi orders were normally covered by a lot of graffiti memorials of the believers who make some sort of a pilgrimage to that sort of tombs and so on. And those of memorial graffitis which were normally in calligraphic forms was normally performed by the believers to show their respect to the the tomb and so on. That could be helpful in case of most of the theories and most of the assumptions that was intimated by yourself and expressed by yourself during the things. Those of graffitis normally found in the eye level of the believers, not in the upper side of the human body's height. So most of the architectural elements that you've found was normally those are things, those are wall scripts that was at the upper side of the buildings. Are you examine those of things, or these are memorial graffitis or wall scripts are covered by the restoration processes at the Shah Nematollah-Vali's complex? I'm really curious about any sort of evidence of those things, or any sort of examination of the content of those things that is normally easy to find in other tomes, just like the Bayazid Bastami's complex are fully covered by those of wall writings and graffiti memorials.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. It's a very interesting question. I mean, you see some graffiti here and there, but I wouldn't compare it to Bastam, for instance, in that case. So you see, I've noted minimal things here and there, and none of them actually are necessarily datable or dated or in good hands, I would say, in terms of calligraphy. However, I think there are spaces in Mahan particularly where you would expect to see them. I think the lower parts of the Chelakhane, I don't know how many images of that I showed you, but some of the swords that I was showing you, you could see that a lot of the painting and calligraphy was lost. There are some empty spaces below that, but due to recent floods, all of those parts have been washed out completely and destroyed. So it's just new plaster on those parts. So we don't necessarily see the graffiti that could have been there, which is very you would expect it because it's at the lower levels. Trying to think if in the Dakhani parts, I mean, again, I would assume probably in Shah Khalilullah's tomb in the Deccan because it's plaster. But again, a lot of these are kind of whitewashed, the plaster afterwards. But that's a really good question. I have to think about the examples that I have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Your words concerning, Shah Nematollah-Vali's Khanaqah are really informative. Concerning the traces of the poetic of a space, I think much more attention should be paid because as you walk in Mahan, you can even talk to certain people who lived there before, who were, resident there, and a good source for that, I think, is Dr. Nurbash's Sufi magazine. And when I was in Sydney, I had the chance to go to Canada and come across so many of those magazines. And I think the space is very important. The link between the outer and the inner worlds. And I appreciate that. Thank you very much. And another question is concerning the traditional, architecture. You treated wonderfully. What I'm interested is in the modern, the structure of the modern Khanaqahs throughout the world. Because now we have got,
Of course, yes.
Yes, in Africa, in South America. I want to know the way the concept of the divine is expressed in those architectures. that should be great.
Thank you. Thank you so much for those questions. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, there's a lot locally available. And I've spent some time in Mahan. I wish I could have spent more time in Mahan. I'm familiar with the magazines. And I also have to mention, in terms of, because you were talking about the poetics and the relation between the poetics and local sources. The one thing that I didn't talk about, and I talk about a little bit in the book in terms of the poetry in the Chellakhane, is that a lot of it is very Mahan-centric.
Yes.
In praise of Mahan, coming down to the Chellakhane, to the shrine, to Mahan, and then going all the way to Najaf and Karbala and the cosmos. So Mahan is very much at the center of some of the poems that are written by the disciple. In terms of the modern khanaqahs, you're absolutely right. I mean, I'm talking about the global, so-called global reach of the Ni'matullahi khanaqahs. Unfortunately, I'm only looking at 1400s to 1650s. There's just so much material. And the reason I stopped there is not because the later periods are not more important. I mean,
It was wonderful. You've been eagerly waiting for the book.
Unfortunately, I have not done the work on modern. I think it's a very, very good topic in terms of 19th. Even in the 19th century, there's just so much to cover art historically.
Thank you. One thing that I want to mention, please keep your questions shorter, and because there are a lot of questions. And so we go to the online question. Now, this is a general question. Were the Safavids also Sufis? Obviously, were the Sufis considered as more moderate and non-violent in their spread of Islam? What made Safavid very violent in their spread of Islam if they were also Sufis? But this also kind of relates to my own question. Where you see Mahan, the whole complex, which most of it, as you showed, is Safavid inventory reimagination of Sufi order, but it was in statement of the poverty of the Safavids.
Yeah.
In terms of the sword, having all kind of things to jihad and being the dominant Sufi narratives of the day.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's just so much to cover there. The Ni'matullahi under the Safavid, it's just a fascinating story because they kind of challenge a lot of our perceptions about Sufism under the Safavids in general. I mean, there was a widespread persecution of a lot of different Sufi networks under the Safavids, apart from the Safaviya Sufi order. But the Ni'matullahis were kind of like an exception. And I talk a lot about that in the book in terms of how they were an exception and they're not an exception, because it wasn't just kind of linear relationship with the Safavid court. There were a lot of ups and downs. They came out and supported the Safavids in the beginning. Even there are in hagiographic writings, they're writing about how the Safavids were destined to be the rulers of Iran, of course. So they received support from the Safavids. And because before the move of the capital to Isfahan, the Ni'matullahis were very powerful in central Iran. In fact, the Safavids kind of allied with them to control those parts, Yazd and Kerman. But then after the kind of relocation of the capital, things changed, both because of what I just described, but also because of the kind of jihad against the Safavids through Beyt Ashfan, the governor of Kerman. So there are a lot of ups and downs, and I think a lot of this material, I read them in the book, the carpets, the swords, the Taj, the 12-segmented Taj, the Taj of the Safavids. I think a lot of them can be read in both in terms of alliance, but also competition with the Safavids, I think. And I think there are instances in which you can think about the expansion of the shrine in Mahan in terms of its competition with the Ardabil as well. There is definitely that.
Thank you very much. Go to an online question. Jane Lewison, please unmute yourself and ask the question.
Yes, I thank you so much. It was such a really fantastic talk, and you're focusing in on something that nobody has really focused on. So thank you for that. But I wanted to ask you, just as you enter the Chelehone, there is a kind of almost a semi-pastoral kind of scene on the wall, a rider on a horse or a donkey. Did
Yes.
you? What do you think about that? And did you look at the Mostarrier and the calligraphy in the Mostarrier?
Thank you so much for that question. Yes, there was just so much. I mean, I don't deal with the scene that you're talking about in the book. I've set it aside, hopefully, for an article in the future. I think it's very interesting in terms of the kind of references to the 14 Immaculate Ones and the Shia Imams in the Chelehane, and I see that scene of the flamed rider. I think that's what you're talking about. That you see when you're almost done, you turn around and want to leave the Chelehane. I think it probably has to do with the Shia Imams and kind of the gathering of blessing by, again, a visual encounter with that painting. I have looked at the calligraphy in Mostarrier, but I'm not sure. I haven't made any connections. I don't know if you have any suggestions or for any links that may be there, but I kind of looked at it early on when I was working on this project and haven't gone back to them really. So yeah, thank you.
Well,
Thank you.
the Mostarrier was also a Nematalahi Hanra,
Yes.
and
Yes.
used up until the early 20th century. It was used, and still on Thursday nights, people go there and they distribute chai and shirini. But it's not. It's not used anymore for majlis or anything like that. But it had been used up until the early part of the 20th century for majlis. And there is a Chelehone there, a small Chelehone, just as you walk in, and before you get to the decorative hall where all the tiles are. Just a small little room there on the side, which was used as a Chelehone.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, I remember the Chelehane and Mostarrier. I haven't made any connections between this and the other Chelehane. I compare it with other Chelehanes. I don't know. I think I've treated this as kind of a singular example because I don't know of any other examples that are so.
Yeah, so decorated, and I completely agree with you as far as the talismanic aspect of it, because people, when they're in Chalet, they have their eyes closed most of the time, so they're not reading these inscriptions. They're sort of imbibing the atmosphere of them. And up until recently, you could, before they put that plexiglass there, you could go and sit in the Chelehone, and there was an atmosphere in there. You could sense it, and so. This was more to create an atmosphere, I think, than actually as something for people to read.
Yeah, thank you. No, absolutely. And nowadays you can't actually really enter the Chelehane anymore. I was very lucky that I could actually spend time in it and take all the photographs, but now you can almost enter it, but there is a glass kind of container almost surrounded by plexiglass walls, so you're kind of inside it, but don't see everything.
Thank you so much.
Again, thank you so much for your talk. It's really fantastic.
With this spreading Sufi ideas to India, is there any evidence to suggest that it had a role to play in the formation of the thought of Darshikoh in the 17th century?
Sorry, I didn't get the middle of your question.
I said, with the spread of the Sufi order going to India, is there any evidence to suggest that they had a role to play in the influence of the thought of Darshikoh when it came to the Mughal Empire?
I haven't found any relationships with Darshikoh, really. And my understanding is that that's the Naqshbandi order. The connections are with the Naqshbandi order there. But we definitely see with the second wave, when they go to the Mughal ports of Lahore and Delhi, they're going back again down to the Deccan, and they're taking on important projects around the Nizamuddin Dargah in Delhi. The Nematallahis do a whole refurbishment of Nizamuddin Dargah. as well. So they're definitely kind of engaged in the scene of practicing Sufism in Delhi and in Lahore, but I don't know of any connections with Arshad.
Thank you so much for the amazing. I have a question about the. You talk about the all this material culture, corpus, textile, and also the architectural decoration. What was the relationship between the main architects? Were they necessarily or probably part of the Islamic community, or maybe they were just belonging part of the community outside the Islamic world there, and they just made these objects through the maybe institutional work, the process like this involved, and also something for the process of making side daily methodology teachings. Is there any like honoring process of making?
Thank you. That's a very interesting question. So I think I mentioned briefly that from the 16th century onwards, in 16th and 17th century, I see a lot of connections between the artists who are working in the shrines and on the objects having an immateriality affiliation. Before that, we do have signatures here and there, but we just don't know anything about the artist. And we don't know anything about these artists whose signature we see that, and we know that they had mythology affiliations really in the architecture. From manuscripts, we know that a number of the mythologies were very good calligraphers, and it seems like there was a training and teaching process as well. And also we know that in 16th and 17th centuries, they were important collectors and makers of albums. We don't know what exactly were in those albums, whether was calligraphy necessarily or calligraphy and painting, but we have descriptions of them in some monographs. Collectors, connoisseurs, and calligraphers themselves and poets. So, did you have a second question?
I asked that certainly
Oh yeah.
in the name of like
I think I've
the philosophy of making or the process of making, honor making,
Oh, okay.
craft making, or space building.
I mean, that's a very, very good question. I mean, we don't get that necessarily from hagiographies, from writings that are coming from inside of the orders, but we know of, for instance, important artistic treatises like a calligraphic treatise that was finished in Deccan India in the 15th century and is dedicated or patronized by Ni'matullahi Sufi leaders in the Deccan. So we know that they're definitely very well connected with artistic networks and scholarly networks. But in terms of direct writing, I can't put my finger on one thing and say, yes, but it was there. Thank you.
Actually, kind of a follow-up question. I was curious about the process of these arts being made, as in who would sign off these arts? Because you describe them almost as part of the rituals and the innovations. It's not just one skilled artist choose these forms, or it's part of the ritual. So I was thinking, who would sign off on what should be on the wall? Would it be the master sitting with?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I mean, for instance, I think I mentioned in the case of the design of the hat, hagiographic texts say Shah Ni'matullah himself signed on it and said, this is the hat, now we can make it. But again, this is through text that we know. In terms of a project like the Chilnekhane, I mean, in the textile, the carpets that I showed you, definitely there was a very kind of thorough process of designing, writing the poetry in itself was a process that definitely kind of involved some supervision, patronizing, but also competition. It's fascinating because we have the poems on the carpets that I showed you, but through other manuscripts, I found evidence of this 17th century scholar and poet who seems to have wanted to compose the poems for these carpets because he had heard that Abul Mahdi, the Nematology descendant, was making these amazing carpets for the shrine. So he wanted to write the poems. So he just composes poems and sends them with a letter. And they're very kind of like thematically very similar to the poems that are inscribed on the carpet, but he doesn't end up actually like I don't think they buy his poets. It's someone else because we have actually the name of the poet on the carpet and the poems are a little bit different. So we know that, it was really kind of a process that was that artists locally knew about, they wanted to participate in, and there was definitely some sort of supervision over it as well.
We have a question online. Sadra, please unmute yourself.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much for your fascinating presentation. I happen to be an architect as well, so I was especially interested from my discipline. The references in the art and the poetry within the Chilakhana you highlighted, including the reference to the 12 Imams, the reference to the Zulfiqar, or the poetry referencing travel between Karbala, Najaf, and Mahan, are very uniquely Shia-derived influences. In the Indian subcontinent, my experience with Sufi shrines doesn't have that reference because my understanding is that predominant Sufi global context is derived from Sunni Islam, and it may be particular, the Shia interpretation may be particular to Iran. And I've even heard that the Mir-Djalali's are probably the only Shia order within Sufism. And I'm curious about your observation about the uniquely Shia derivative in the experience of the art in the Chilakhana you're referencing versus in places like Delhi and Lahore. What are the differences from those two schools of thought?
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that question. I mean, we definitely have Shia and Sunni Sufi orders. The Nematologists themselves, in the earlier periods, there's some sort of confessional ambiguity around whether they were Sunni or Shia. There's a lot of debate, but at the time the Chilakhana was made under the Safavids, they are definitely aligning themselves with Shia beliefs. But references to 12 Shias doesn't also, I'm not saying that the references in the Chilakhana are not Shia, but we also have those inscriptions in the Bahmani tomb in the Deccan. And again, both in terms of, in the case of Nematologists in 15th century Deccan and Bahmanis in the Deccan, there is some ambiguity about whether they were Shia or Sunni or had some Shia inclination. So they're definitely there in terms of material culture, the Shia references.
Thank you.
The last question would be Leila.
Thank you so much for your interest. Yes. Yeah, it's just maybe to travel to my city, my home city, Kerman. Oh, and I'm coming from that place. And whenever I travel to Mahan, I go to Shanabuti, different experience, especially when you just enter the building and you go to a very, very intimate place, and it gives you that intimacy that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. I just wanted to know that because I know, you had that traveling experience too. So as a researcher, how do you navigate your presence with the intimacy of your personal spirituality with the sacred space that you actually
Yeah. I mean, that's a very, very good question. I mean, I try to, I think one thing that I really kind of invested in, this has been a project for you guys, probably embarrassing, for over a decade now. And I've really made a point of returning to this space and also kind of talking to the community, to people who visited and use the shrine on a daily basis. I really try to get to know the place, to get to know the people to some extent as much as it's possible, but also trying not to take too much space and be mindful of practices that are happening in the space and kind of timing things, timing research, taking photographs, and then the bulky camera and tripods. It's not always compatible with visitations and rituals. This is what I've tried to do, but I also share that kind of feeling of closeness with the shrine as well, because I've known it over and over throughout the years.
Would this experience make you an anthropological architect? Because that observation participation becomes more of a anthropological.
That's an interesting question. I mean, I think probably not, because I'm not studying contemporary and modern period, I would say. I mean, if I were, I would definitely have to answer yes to that question. I mean, I'm not saying that
you're recovering the intimacy
absolutely
and the space.
Yes.
Is there sort of an observation that is read back to the historical time?
I mean, I think my contemporary experience of this space has definitely informed how, I kind of get back into time for sure. I mean, we all have to do that for sure. I think my initial response was, if I'm comparing if I was working on contemporary and modern kind of architectural history of the Nematolites, it would be a very different answer. I think it's more ambiguous in this sense. But I've definitely experienced that. I've also, it was really, really interesting with the Çerlekhane. I think I went into Çerlekhane probably 4 times, like 4 years in a row. And I just didn't know what to do with it. It was just that feeling of overwhelm and the intensity of this space. I just didn't know how to approach it. And I think it took me years to actually come around and kind of like take my time, really sit with the paintings and the poetry and kind of try to understand what's happening in there. I don't know if that's related to your question, but it kind of relates to the sense of observation of this space.
Can I just do one short comment? First of all, thank you so much. This was wonderful. And I've always sort of looked at the building, but I think this sense of experience that brings you to the question of anthropology is becoming, is sort of the most recent trend in approaches to Islamic architecture. We're all looking at buildings and thinking, well, yes, we can study them as schools, as patronage, as something, but there is the aspect that these are buildings that were built by people, used by them. There is a certain experience. So in a sense, as architectural historians, we are really engaging with the experience of being, seeing, and acting in the building. And this is a great example of this. Does that make the experience anthropological? I think we are borrowing tools from different fields. And this is a very great example of how the approach is changing. I'm always reminded that the late, great Olive Bravar, who wrote quite a lot about the Great Mosque of Isfahan, he has a section where he once says, he was sitting and watching people going in and praying. And he writes about how it dawned on him all of a sudden that he writes about the building, its evolution, its architecture, the inscriptions, what dates, the different aspects of it, but he has never thought of it as a place that has a different meaning and experience to people, and that actually is a place of prayer before being the architectural monument. So this was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think these are really, really good points. And especially, I think our work as art historians, architectural historians I think we need to synthesize two of these approaches, because I'm looking at the buildings as documents, but I'm also thinking about the experience of this space, and especially in cases where there isn't much textual evidence on these spaces, on the architecture. We have to go to the architecture in order to recover the history of these people, because really the architecture is telling us things that the historical sources do not. about the history of the Nematomanis themselves in that period.
Oh, there was one question. Okay, this is the last question.
Most of the evidence you were talking about concentrated on Iranian Sufism to produce so many considerable number of the Indian one, but not be affected that the Indian intimacy of Iran, and then the main theme of your speech was India as well, but you didn't mention.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I had to make difficult choices in terms of what I was focusing on. I mean, the book is kind of half and half between Iran, Deccan India, and a little bit of Mughal India as well. So I get into the kind of the Ahmad Shah Bahmani's tomb, the tomb of the son of Shah Ni'matullahi in the Deccan, and also how, again, like we see that kind of the same layering of the shrines over decades and centuries as members of the order kind of return to these sites, come back from North India to the Deccan to kind of refurbish the shrines as well. So, I mean, I would have to say, yes, it is in the book, but sorry, I didn't talk more about that today.
And you're speaking at Iranian studies.
Exactly. I mean, at the end of the day, that's like I had to make a difficult choice, but that's what made me make this choice. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Firouzeh, for an excellent talk, bringing Mohan to Toronto and talking intimately
And yourself too.
about the whole aspect of Sufi shrine, especially in the Iranian context. Thank you so much. And again, welcome to Toronto.